With my exposure control adjusted, I'm ready to start getting the lights a little better looking in my jungle. What I'll start out with here is a quick full render to see how this looks. It's always good occasionally, even though we're testing in regions, to do a frame render and make sure there's nothing that's getting overlooked. What I'll do as part of this as well is just put in my frame size as HD 720 so I see a little wider. I'll press F10 or click on the Render Setup button. And in the Common tab, where we control the size of the image we're making and where it's going, I'll drop down under Output Size and choose HDTV. I'll pick 1280 by 720. This is the native resolution for YouTube and Vimeo, for example. So if you'd like to make a movie and post your work online, author it at this spec. What I can do as well, to make sure my cameras come out right, is go back to Custom and change the aperture. But I'm going to leave that alone for the moment. Right now, though, when I hit render, I'll get a much bigger image, and I'll get a pretty good idea of how my whole scene looks. We can see in here as well, by changing that size, my safe frame, Shift F being the hotkey, has gotten wider. When I turn it off and on, we can see even with the region render through it, that I'm getting a nice wide frame here, and I'll minimize my ribbon toolbar for the graphite modeling tools as well. That's how the frame works. Remember that these are gray because it'll only show one map at a time when we're instancing maps, but in the render these other plants look just fine. I'll hit render and check. Things are looking pretty good, although it looks like I forgot to turn off my region render. To get out of a render, hit escape. Now I'll pick View again under Area to Render, and at the bottom of this frame buffer I can hit Render. This is looking pretty good. The earlier adjustments on the exposure had let me see the underside of my large striped plants, although they may be a little bright on top. I'm getting good value in the shadows, and I'd like to adjust how the light bounces and spreads. Down at the bottom of this dialog, I'll kick up the final gather bounces to 2. This is a good minimum, so we start to get some lift in the lighting. Theoretically, you could go quite higher, 4, 7, 8 even, so we get a really nice bounce of light. As a comparison, I'll do one more region and see how this looks. The differences are subtle but noticeable. What we're seeing is that there's a little more lift, a little more softness in the lighting in the scene because of that extra light bounce, that it's not quite as heavy in the dark areas. And I'm ready to get that sun adjusted. I'll select the sun by name, hitting Escape to get out of the render region, and now I'm ready to press H, the hotkey for Select from Scene. In my Select from Scene dialog, I can filter to my sun if needed. What I can do is turn off geometry, for example, and there's the compass, underneath of which is the daylight system. I'll select it, click OK, and go over to the modifier panel. What this says is it's using the Mental Ray daylight system. Mr. Sun and Mr. Sky are playing nicely together. Actually, Mental Ray Sun and Mental Ray Sky is the way we read it. What I can do then, assuming I've gone into the setup and placed this, which I had in a previous video, right in the middle of the Amazon, is that I can add a haze into the scene and play with the multiplier on the sun. Here's how this works. The sky is actually the controlling object for everything, and we're working in a haze-driven model. There's a multiplier on the sun and the sky, brightness of each, and a softness on the sun for the shadows. What I'll do is first scroll down and add some haze in. This goes between 0 and 15, 0 being exactly clear and 15 being very overcast. I'll put it in as 3. This way, I start to simulate the bounce of the light off the water in the air from a, well, steamy jungle. I'll bring up my rendered frame window and run another region. This is going to start to give me a radically different render. Once I start to get that haze in, we can see that the darks get brighter and the brights get darker. Haze also gives me the yellow component in a rendering, as we can see that the sky now has a tint to it. It's adding more light in the scene, softening the depth of those shadows. Instead of being this very deep color, they're starting to get some light going on in them. We can keep going with the haze, and maybe a boost up to 4 would help, just a little extra light in there. Now what I'll think about is the multiplier of the sun and sky relative to each other. Right now my sun is nice and bright, and my sky is fairly bright as well. I can take up the multiplier of the sky. Here's 1.1 for example, and it's going to give me a little better overall brightness. Again, I'll test render a region. As we can see, it's got a really nice lift to it. With this done, I'll play with the sun. The multiplier of 1 is good. If I want a little brighter sunlight, I can boost this up. Here's 1.2 for example. Notice there's no color control on it. It's just a brightness. And the reason for that is that it is a physical daylight system. It thinks it is the sun and that there is a sky, and hence air, that bounces the light, with the possibility of water. So the color comes from the angle of the sun and the place on the planet. I'll soften out the shadows, putting in a softness here of 2, and upping those softness samples to avoid any dots in the shadow edges. I'll try 16 here, and render again. This is getting nicer looking. Instead of razor crisp shadows, they're really softening out, and I'm getting a much nicer look in the scene. Rich colors and soft shadows with blurry edges. I'm getting color under the leaves as well as on top, and my jungle is really starting to perk up. It looks like I need to lower the brightness a little bit, as it's a little too pink versus my ground color here should be a little bit darker. I can also play with this in the material editor if I'd like. Finally, in our scene, we've got some non-physical tuning, and this is accessible here under the sky, which again is the control object. There's a horizon, because the sky is actually a gradient, giving us this wraparound blue. If we see under the horizon here, it's gray. We can blur that if we need and move it around if we see it, but for now it's okay. What I will do, though, in the non-physical tuning is add in a 0.1. In the non-physical tuning, red is positive and blue is negative, so a little extra warmth in the scene comes from a positive red. I can also play with the saturation, and what this controls for us is the amount of color contribution from the sky. If I'm feeling like my shadows have too much blue in them, I can lower that saturation, pulling the color from the sky out and graying those shadows. I'll try a render and see the difference. It's a subtle difference, but it's one worth noting. What I can see here in the comparison is that a little extra red and a little extra haze gives me both yellow and warmth, softness in the scene. The original on the right is very, very crisp, and the colors are almost stark. There's a lot of blue in the shadows. On the left side, I've muddied things up with the yellow, and the yellow works nicely with all the tones in my plants. I've also warmed up the scene a little bit, giving it a little bit of red through orange basically in all the plants, which works very well with the flowers and complements these leaves. This is how we can adjust this daylight very nicely, and we can keep pushing around these values as we need to really get this to pop out. There's one last thing I'll do. I'm going to press 8 and pull up my environment dialog, and up that aperture just a bit. I'd like to let a little bit less light in. Here's an f6, and I'm also going to take the mid-tone value down to 1.5, actually darkening the scene just a bit. I'll try a quick render and show the result and then my final adjustment. What we'll see is as we start to bounce more light around from the sky, we need to adjust our exposure a little bit to compensate, so things aren't overly bright. That's better. As that exposure comes down, limiting the amount of light in, and the midtones drop down, we really start to see all the colors in the flowers popping out. Now I'm going to boost up the sun just a little bit more. Here's a 1.4 for example, and I'm going to soften out these shadows even a little bit more. Here's 2.5. This way, I get dappled shadows everywhere with soft edges, as befitting the haze we'd see in the jungle. I've got a good strong sun, but a nice bounce from the sky, giving me good overall light. I'll put up my final gather bounces to 4 and hit render, and I should get a pretty good looking scene overall. This is going where I want it to. The colors are nice and bright, and the flowers really pop. The leaves have, well, that kind of candy-colored brightness they're intended to. It is a rather cartoon or stylized jungle. There's good value in the shadows, and they're not too blue. They're also nice and soft and coming out from the plants correctly, crisp at the base and fuzzing out over distance. I can see the underside of my leaves from the extra light bounce, and there's kind of a yellow cast, just a little bit of light bouncing off the water and the air as we'd expect on a hazy day in a jungle. Now we'll add in some other lights in the next video, and that way we can perk up any areas of leaves that are perhaps too dark.